The air in the Capitol's East Rotunda felt heavier than usual, as if the building itself had paused to listen. Sunlight cut through the tall arched windows, striking the marble floor in cold, pale streaks. Tourists and staff moved in slow ripples. Around the echoing chamber, their conversations dissolving into the kind of quiet that comes when tension sharpens the air. Jasmine Crockett stood near one of the columns, flanked by a pair of aides who were trying, without much success, to usher her toward the chamber entrance. She wasn't moving. Her attention had locked onto a man standing 10 feet away, mid-50s, sun-leathered face, baseball cap pulled low, and a bright red Save America placard clutched like a shield against his chest. His voice was a blunt instrument, pounding through the space. This government is out of control. You're stripping away freedoms, drowning this country in socialism. His words spilled into each other, riding the adrenaline rush that only comes from the certainty of being right. Jasmine's expression stayed unreadable, though her jaw tensed just enough to betray that she was calculating. The man stepped forward, finding his rhythm. You stole an election. You silence free speech. You protect criminals while attacking patriots. And you, she raised her hand, a subtle command that halted him for a heartbeat. You've said a lot, she replied evenly. But here's my question. You just told me you want less government interference in people's lives, yet you demand laws that control women's bodies. How do you square that? The man blinked, lips parting as if the words had been swiped from his mouth mid-sentence. His eyes darted sideways, toward the growing semicircle of onlookers. The crowd murmured, a ripple of human static. A young woman in a denim jacket lowered her phone for a moment, eyebrows raised. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, but didn't look away. The aides shifted uneasily, sensing this was becoming more than a quick exchange. That's different, the protester stammered finally, his voice losing a layer of its earlier force. Different how? Jasmine's tone was surgical, not raised, but precise enough to make the question feel like a scalpel. The protester shifted his placard, gripping the edges tighter, as if physical pressure might hold his ground for him. But she didn't let the pause linger. Because it fits your worldview? Because you get to decide which freedoms count? Her eyes didn't blink, and her voice had the cadence of a cross-examination. A faint gasp came from someone behind them. Phones stayed high, capturing every flicker of expression, every tightening jaw muscle, every breath between retorts. In that moment, the air in the rotunda no longer belonged to the tourists or the marble silence of history. It belonged to these two, and to the invisible millions who would soon watch and decide, in the court of public opinion, who had just lost the argument before it even began. The man's face lingered in Jasmine's mind, even as the rotunda's noise swelled again. She'd seen him before, though not in person. His profile picture had appeared more than once in forwarded screenshots from her staff, always attached to some viral clip of a rally or a live-streamed monologue about saving America. Weeks earlier, during a morning briefing, one of her aides had pulled up his Facebook feed on a tablet. Grainy videos from parking lots and courthouse steps. Grainy but loud, the kind of voice that carried not just conviction, but a practiced defiance. He'd been in Waco during Trump's spring rally, a blur of red and white signs behind the stage. He'd shown up at the Austin Capitol to denounce indoctrination in schools, holding up a list of books he wanted banned from libraries. It wasn't chance that had brought him here. Crockett knew the pattern. People like him didn't wander into her path. They tracked her public appearances, waiting for the right moment to stage a confrontation that would play well to their own online audience. Her aides had recognized him the second he walked into the rotunda, phone already set to record. One of them had leaned in and murmured, "That's the guy from the book ban hearing last year." She had nodded once, understanding immediately. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange of views. She replayed his words in her head, the ones about tyranny, about stolen elections. They weren't spontaneous. They were the talking points of a movement, repackaged for the 100th time, designed to provoke rather than persuade. Yet standing here now, just feet away, she could see something that didn't translate in his online clips, the flicker in his eyes when she'd pressed him on Contradictions, the hesitation that, if caught on camera, would speak louder than any slogan on a placard. She took a half-step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble. "You've been at this a long time," she said, almost conversationally. "Rallies, school board meetings, state house steps, always saying you want freedom." His jaw tightened. "Because I do. Freedom for everyone, or just people who think like you?" He let out a short laugh, a kind that tried to mask discomfort. "You politicians twist everything. I'm talking about real Americans. And who decides who's real?" She tilted her head, watching him search for an answer that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Around them, the crowd seemed to lean in, sensing that the exchange had moved beyond slogans into something far riskier, the kind of personal scrutiny that stripped away performance. She'd seen it before in the courtroom. A witness who had rehearsed their story so many times they believed it, until one question landed like a hammer against glass. And here, under the Capitol dome, with phones raised like a forest of antennas, she knew the next few minutes would decide which side's clip went viral first, his or hers. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Years in the courtroom had taught her that power didn't always come from volume. It came from precision. "You claim the Second Amendment is absolute," she began, her words deliberate, the tone almost too calm for the charged air around. Let's talk about that." The man straightened, as though ready to deliver a well-worn speech. "The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It's right there in the Constitution." "And yet," she replied, taking a slow step closer, in District of Columbia v. Heller, Justice Scalia, a conservative icon, wrote that the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. He said it's not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, for whatever purpose. The protester hesitated, blinking rapidly. That's not me talking," she cut in. "That's Scalia. The same court decision your side celebrated as a victory still acknowledged limits. Which means you're standing here, quoting the Constitution without acknowledging the parts that contradict you." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. A man in a veteran's cap whispered something to the woman beside him. The protester's grip on his placard tightened until his knuckles went white. "That's one example," she continued, her voice steady. "But let's take another. You say government overreach is destroying freedom. Then you call for nationwide abortion bans. You want the state to control women's choices, even when those choices have nothing to do with you. Explain to me how that's less government interference." He shifted his weight, eyes flicking from her to the people watching. "It's about protecting life." "Whose life?" Her question landed without pause. "Because you've made it clear you're not talking about the women. You're not talking about the survivors of rape or the people whose health is at risk. You're talking about an ideology, one that demands obedience from everyone, regardless of their circumstances." The marble chamber felt smaller now, the echoes sharper, every sound bouncing back with double the weight. "You twist my words," he said, his voice dropping into something almost defensive. "I'm not twisting anything," Jasmine replied. "I'm holding your words up to the light. And if they can't survive there, maybe the problem isn't me." Someone in the crowd let out an audible, almost involuntary, "Oh." Phones tilted higher, lenses capturing not just the exchange, but the shifting balance in the space, the sense that control was sliding away from him. piece by piece. She could see it now, the faint crack in his composure. He'd come here armed with slogans and certainty. But certainty was fragile when facts started cutting into it. And Jasmine had no intention of letting him leave with his armor intact. Jasmine let the silence stretch, just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Years of cross-examining witnesses had taught her that sometimes the most damaging thing you could do was simply wait. Her eyes stayed locked on him, reading every flicker of uncertainty in his face. Then she took a measured step closer. "Let's move away from legal theory," she said, her tone almost conversational. "Let's talk about you." The protester frowned, wary now. "What about me?" "You've said, in this building, at school board meetings, at rallies, that government should stay out of people's personal lives. That it should never dictate how we live, what we read, or how we worship, correct?" "That's right," he said quickly, as if rehearsed. "Then why," she asked, "did you speak in favor of banning more than 20 books from your district's high school library?" The question hit harder than her tone suggested. His jaw shifted. "Those books are dangerous? Dangerous to whom?" She didn't blink. "They push an agenda. They confuse kids." Jasmine's voice sharpened. "Or they teach them to think for themselves. You claim to defend freedom, but the moment that freedom produces ideas you dislike, you want to shut them down. That's not freedom. That's censorship." A murmur passed through the rotunda, low at first, then swelling as people turned to one another. A young man in a gray hoodie whispered to his friend, "She's got him." The protester's eyes darted to the crowd, searching for support, but the faces he found weren't nodding in agreement anymore. They were watching like jurors, weighing every answer, every hesitation. "You can't just," he began. "I can," she cut in, "because these are your own words, recorded, public record. And here you are, saying one thing when it suits you, then doing the exact opposite when it doesn't." His breathing grew heavier. The placard he'd been holding as a symbol now looked more like a shield, something to hide behind. "I believe in protecting kids," he insisted, voice hardening again. "And I believe in protecting the Constitution," Jasmine replied. "That means protecting kids from ignorance, protecting their right to access information, even when it makes some adults uncomfortable." She took one final step toward him, her presence filling the space between them. "If your definition of freedom can't survive in a library, it's not worth much in the real world." A ripple of applause broke from one corner of the crowd. It wasn't loud yet, but it was steady. He looked over, startled by the sound, and in that brief moment, everyone could see it. The first visible crack in the armor he had built for years. By now the rotunda had transformed. What began as scattered bystanders had thickened into a dense semicircle, their faces angled toward the clash at the center. Every cough, every shifting footstep echoed against the marble, like a reminder that they were in a place built for the gravity of debate. Jasmine could feel the crowd's attention, sharpening, the same way jurors leaned forward during a closing argument. It was a quiet power, one she'd learned to recognize and harness. The protester might have thought he was speaking only to her, but now his every word was being measured against the room's collective conscience. She let her voice carry, not by shouting, but by controlling each syllable, shaping them so they landed with weight. "Freedom means the right to make choices for yourself," she said, turning slightly so her words swept across the onlookers. "Unless, of course, you only mean freedom for people who think like you." A woman near the back nodded slowly. A college-aged man in a baseball cap pulled out his phone and began recording again, angling for a better shot. The protester tried to cut in. "You're twisting," Jasmine's gaze snapped back to him. "No, I'm reflecting. If you don't like what you see in the reflection, maybe it's time to ask why." It wasn't just her tone that made the words land. It was the timing. She allowed the silence that followed to linger, forcing him to stand in it. That pause worked like a magnifying glass on his hesitation. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She's killing him." Another voice replied. He walked right into it. The protester adjusted his stance, leaning forward as if bracing for a counterattack. But every move he made seemed reactive now, defensive. He was no longer the instigator. He was the one being questioned, pressed, and slowly dismantled in front of witnesses. Jasmine could feel the energy tilt fully in her direction. She didn't need to rush. Every word was another step in a slow, deliberate march toward the inevitable. "You came here to challenge me," she said, voice low but steady. "But here's the truth. I welcome challenges. I've spent my career in rooms where people told me I didn't belong, where they tried to silence me. And every single time, I met them with facts, with law, with truth." A faint hum of agreement passed through the crowd. It wasn't applause yet, but it was close, that low, collective vibration that came when people were aligning with her side. Even if they hadn't decided to say it out loud, the protester's jaw tightened again. He looked around, perhaps realizing that the people surrounding them weren't just spectators anymore. They were deciding, moment by moment, who had the moral authority in this confrontation. And in that silent calculation, Jasmine could tell. He was already losing. The shifting mood in the rotunda seemed to register in the protester's posture. His shoulders stiffened, his grip on the placard tightening like a lifeline. The cracks in his composure were showing, and he could feel them, so he did what people often do when cornered. He doubled down. "You want to talk contradictions?" He shot back, his voice suddenly louder, bouncing off the high ceilings. "Let's talk about the real problems. The border's wide open. Criminals are flooding in. The election was rigged. Everyone knows it. And the media? They're lying to cover for all of you. It was a hailstorm of grievances, rapid fire, meant to overwhelm." His words bled into each other. No pause for rebuttal, just force and volume, as if sheer noise might reassert control. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let him run through the entire list, her gaze fixed and unbroken. The moment he took a breath, she stepped in, calm, surgical. "Let's start with the border," she said evenly. "According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, illegal. Crossings are actually down from last year. That's public record. You can look it up right now on your phone." The protester opened his mouth, but she kept going. "And about the election, you claim it was rigged. Yet more than 60 lawsuits challenging the results were dismissed, many by judges appointed by Donald Trump himself. That's not my opinion. That's documented fact." A ripple went through the crowd. People were leaning in again, watching. The balance of power shift back to her with each citation. And the media? She tilted her head slightly. If the media were really part of some grand conspiracy, how do you explain the fact that conservative outlets are among the most watched in the country? Or that they're the ones giving you airtime when you say these things? His voice wavered. "They only tell part of the truth." "Then so do you," Jasmine replied sharply. "You tell the part that feeds your anger, but ignore the part that challenges it. And that's not truth. That's propaganda." The last word hung in the air, heavier than the rest. A man in the back let out a low whistle. Someone else muttered, "Damn." Jasmine took a slow step closer, closing the space between them until the weight of her presence was undeniable. "You claim you love this country," she said quietly, "but you refuse to accept the peaceful transfer of power that defines it. You want the rules to apply only when they favor you. That's not patriotism. That's entitlement." The protester's mouth opened, then shut again. The noise of the rotunda seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of camera shutters and the faint hum of air through the vents. And in that stillness, the desperation in his earlier barrage now looked less like strength and more like the Last gasp of a position collapsing under its own weight. The studio lights dimmed slightly as they cut to a commercial break, but the tension in the air didn't fade, it thickened. Crew members rushed around with hushed urgency, pretending the confrontation between Harrison Ford and Joy Behar hadn't just sent ripples through the set, but their eyes told the truth. They'd never seen Joy lose control like that. Harrison remained in his chair, posture rigid yet calm, sipping from a glass of water. He looked like a man who had said exactly what he meant to say and wasn't about to backtrack. Joy, however, paced near her seat, speaking in low tones to a producer who kept glancing nervously toward Ford. Her smile was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and eyes that burned with indignation. Off camera, Sonny Hostin leaned toward Ford, speaking quietly. "You know she's not going to let this slide, right?" Harrison tilted his head slightly, his voice low but steady. "I didn't come here to trade compliments, Sonny. I came here to tell the truth." Meanwhile, producers debated whether to cut the segment short. Ratings would spike, yes, but so would the risk of backlash. A View thrived on heated debates, but this was different. Harrison wasn't playing the talk show game. He was dismantling it, piece by piece. When the cameras came back, Joy tried to mask her anger with a brittle smile. She crossed her legs, leaned forward, and adopted the tone of a seasoned host reclaiming control. "So, Harrison, about this new movie of yours," she began, her words dripping with forced politeness. Ford didn't flinch. "We can talk about the movie, Joy," he said evenly, "but we both know the audience is thinking about what we just discussed. And frankly, so am I." The crowd murmured, sensing that the détente was fragile. Joy straightened, her voice sharpening. "Are you suggesting that your perspective is somehow more valid than mine?" Ford's brow furrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than rage. "I'm suggesting," he replied, "that sometimes the truth isn't about winning an argument. It's about admitting when we've been wrong." That sentence landed like a punch. Joy blinked rapidly, caught between firing back or letting the moment pass. The studio audience leaned forward in unison, sensing a turning point. Sonny, ever the diplomat, stepped in with a neutral question about Ford's environmental activism, trying to shift the conversation. But the electricity between Harrison and Joy remained. Every glance, every pause carried an unspoken challenge. By the end of the segment, applause filled the studio, but it wasn't the polite applause of a typical talk show exit. It was raw, uneven half-admiration for Ford's candor, half-disbelief that anyone had just gone toe-to-toe with Joy Behar, and lived to tell the tale. As they cut to the final break, Joy kept her eyes fixed on her notes. Harrison rose, shook Sonny's hand, and gave Joy a courteous nod, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. The facade had cracked, and everyone knew the next time they crossed paths, the gloves would be off completely. The studio felt hotter than it had all morning, though no one dared mention it. The air seemed to quiver with the aftershocks of the last exchange between Harrison Ford and Joy Behar. The audience, now leaning forward in their seats, sensed they were witnessing something rare, the kind of unscripted television moment that would dominate headlines by nightfall. Joy adjusted her posture, attempting to regain control. "Let's steer this back to the film," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "This isn't the political panel. You're here to promote your work." Harrison's lips curled in a faint, knowing smile. "Funny thing about that," he said, "art is political. Every story we tell reflects who we are and what we value. Pretending otherwise, that's the real fiction." His words were measured, but they landed like thunder in the quiet room. Sonny Hostin, seated 2 chairs away, gave a subtle nod, sensing the shift. "You're saying the movie reflects our times?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, almost inviting him to continue. It doesn't just reflect them, Harrison replied. It warns about them. People keep acting like the divisions we see today are new. They're not. We've been here before. History remembers when leaders sowed fear to maintain power. And history also remembers those who spoke up. Joy's patience snapped. So now you're comparing our leaders to what? Dictators? Tyrants? Harrison, that's inflammatory. It's truthful, Harrison countered, his voice calm but unyielding. If truth feels inflammatory, maybe that says more about the fire than the messenger. The audience erupted in applause. Not polite, measured clapping, but a sudden wave of approval, as if Harrison had spoken something they'd all been thinking. Joy's face tightened, her hand instinctively moving toward her coffee mug before setting it back down without drinking. Camera zoomed in on Harrison's eyes, steady, clear, unafraid. You invited me here, he continued, and I'm grateful for that. But you don't get to dictate which truths are convenient enough to say out loud. We owe more to each other than that. Sunny leaned in, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial tone. So what happens when saying the truth comes with consequences? Harrison paused. The silence stretched long enough for the studio. Lights to hum audibly. Then you pay the price, he said. Because silence costs more. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot dot in the control room. Producers exchanged frantic whispers. Keep the cameras rolling. Don't cut away. They knew this was no longer just an interview. It was a moment of reckoning. For the first time that morning, Joy looked away from Harrison, her gaze sweeping over the audience as if searching for an ally. But the room had shifted. The energy had shifted. Harrison had wrestled the conversation out of her control and placed it firmly in his own hands. And everyone could feel it. The air inside the courtroom was so tight it felt like even the wood paneling strained under the pressure. Every eye was fixed on Harrison Ford and Joy Barr. The hum of whispers that had been present earlier had vanished, replaced by a charged, almost predatory silence. Joy leaned forward, her voice taking on that pointed sharpness she'd honed over decades on television. So, Mr. Ford, she began, her tone drenched with condescension, are you telling us that your view of America is somehow more real than anyone else's, just because you've had a few decades of box office success? Harrison didn't flinch. His jaw was set, but his eyes, they had that piercing steel that could slice through polite theatrics. My view, he said slowly, is based on what I've seen. Not from a stage, not from a script. From living in the real world. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Several jurors exchanged glances. Joy's lips curled into a faint smile that said she thought she'd baited him into overreaching. But Harrison wasn't done. I've seen people lose their homes because the system didn't care. I've seen war veterans sleeping under bridges while billionaires collect tax breaks. And I've seen leaders on both sides who'd rather win an argument than save a life. The judge raised a brow, subtly leaning forward. It was clear Harrison's words weren't just theater, they carried the weight of something deeply personal. Joy tilted her head, feigning curiosity. So you're saying you figured it out? You, Harrison Ford, have the solution to the nation's problems. A flicker of heat crossed Harrison's face. No, I'm saying that pretending they don't exist, that's the real crime. The statement landed like a hammer blow. Gasps rippled through the room. Joy's composure cracked for a split second before she straightened her notes with an almost violent snap dot from the back of the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every flicker of emotion. They knew. This was no longer a polite exchange. It had become a public reckoning. Joy tried to recover, her voice dripping with sarcasm. So, Mr. Ford, are you accusing me of ignoring the truth? Harrison's gaze locked with hers, steady and unblinking. I'm accusing all of us, especially those with a microphone, of choosing comfort over courage." The words echoed in the silence that followed. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. For a long moment, Joy said nothing. Then, in a voice sharper than glass, she muttered, "Well, I suppose Hollywood heroes always think they're saving the day." Harrison leaned back, his eyes still fixed on her. "Maybe, but sometimes the truth needs a hero more than an audience." The gavel struck, signaling a recess, but the tension didn't leave the room. It followed everyone out into the corridors, clinging to them like smoke. The studio air was heavy with the residue of everything that had just transpired. Lights still glared hot overhead, the hum of cameras still whirred, but the audience had fallen into an uneasy hush, caught between the thrill of live drama and the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Harrison Ford leaned forward in his chair. His posture relaxed now, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a quiet precision that said the conversation was not over. Across from him, Joy Behar adjusted her papers with nervous, jerky movements. The smile she wore was brittle, stretched, too thin to hide the crack in her confidence, thought the producers. Sensing that the tension could either implode or ignite, gave no signal to cut. They knew better. Whatever was about to happen, America needed to see it. "You know, Joy," Harrison began, his tone measured, almost conversational, "I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone's not arguing to understand, they're arguing to win." The audience shifted, leaning forward. The words weren't loud, but they had weight. Joy gave a tight laugh. "Oh, come on, Harrison. You're making it sound like I'm the villain here. We're just having a debate." He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "A debate implies mutual respect. You've been swinging at me since I sat down cutting me off, twisting my words, tossing in little digs when you think I won't notice." He paused, letting the silence hang. "I notice." The crowd reacted. Some gasped, others chuckled nervously. Joy's cheeks flushed a deep shade of red. "Listen," she started, "if you can't handle—" "No," Harrison interrupted, his voice calm but absolute, the kind of tone that silences a room. "If you can't handle a guest speaking their truth without being dressed down for ratings, maybe it's time you rethink what this show stands for." A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Even Sonny Hostin glanced between them, wide-eyed. Joy tried to regain control. "This isn't about ratings. Of course it is," Harrison said, leaning back with a faint smile. "That's the game. But here's the difference. You play for outrage. I play for truth, and truth doesn't need to shout." The words landed like a gavel strike. Somewhere in the back, a cameraman stifled a laugh. The audience broke into applause, spontaneous, loud, and lingering. Joy's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile, raising her hands as if to calm the reaction. "Well," she said, her voice tinged with irritation, "I think we've given the internet enough to talk about today." Harrison rose slowly, shaking, hands with Sonny before turning to Joy. He extended his hand. For a moment, she hesitated, but the cameras were still rolling. She shook it, her grip quick and cold dot as he walked off stage. The cheers followed him. In that moment, it was clear to everyone watching. Harrison Ford hadn't just won an argument. He had claimed the last word. And in live television, that's the only word that matters. The red light above the camera flicked back on, signaling. They were live once more. Harrison Ford sat forward in his chair now, the easygoing smile gone. His hands were clasped on the desk, knuckles taut, as if anchoring himself to the moment. Joy Behar straightened in her seat, the faintest trace of defiance in her eyes, but the tension in her jaw betrayed the storm brewing beneath. "Welcome back," she began, voice cool and composed. "We're still joined by Harrison Ford, and we were just talking about—" She hesitated, just a beat too long. his latest film. Harrison's gaze didn't waver. "No, Joy," he said evenly, the gravel in his voice carrying a weight the audience could feel. "We were talking about truth, and maybe about how easily it gets twisted on television." The audience shifted. In their seats, some chuckled nervously. Others leaned forward. Joy's smile tightened. "Harrison, this isn't exactly a political program, isn't it?" He interrupted, still calm, but now with an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "When you use the platform to frame conversations in a certain light, when you bait guests into defending themselves instead of discussing the work, that's politics." A murmur rippled through the studio. Joy's co-hosts glanced at each other, unsure whether to step in. Joy raised an eyebrow. "You seem awfully sensitive today." Harrison tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You mistake clarity for sensitivity. I've spent a career playing characters who can smell a setup from a mile away. And right now, Joy, I feel like I'm in one." The live audience reacted audibly this time, some clapping, some gasping. Joy straightened her posture, as if physically bracing against him. "Well, Harrison, if you think you're being ambushed, I don't think," he said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried across the entire studio. "I know." It wasn't shouted, but it hit harder than any raised voice could. The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. Joy exhaled sharply, a half-laugh escaping her lips. "This is unexpected." "That's because you expected me to smile, say my lines, and let you control the narrative," Harrison said. "But I'm not here to be polite at the expense of honesty." One of the producers off camera gestured wildly, signaling to wrap or cut to commercial, but the host and guest were locked in. Neither flinched. Finally, Joy looked to the camera, her smile brittle. "We'll be right back after this short break." The second the red light above the camera dimmed, the studio erupted not with cheers, but with the hum of voices, producers rushing forward and co-hosts whispering urgently. Harrison remained still, his eyes never leaving Joy's, as if to make sure she understood one thing. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning.